The phone didn't ring on Sunday. That might not mean anything to most people. But in my house, Sunday at noon had been the same for 11 years. Clifton would call. We'd talk for 20, sometimes 30 minutes, about nothing important, about everything that mattered. His week, my garden. Whatever was weighing on either one of us at the time, it was ours. So when that Sunday passed without a call, I noticed. Not with panic, just with the quiet awareness of a woman who knows her own house well enough to feel when something inside it has shifted. I'm Ernestine Ashford. I raised one child, buried one husband, and built a life that required both hands and most of my courage. I am not a woman who falls apart easily. I am not a woman who chases people who are walking away from her. But I am a mother. And mothers notice things long before other people are willing to name them. Clifton and I were close in the way that only happens when it's been just the two of you for a very long time. Roosevelt Ashford passed when Clifton was 19, old enough to understand death permanently, young enough that it still reshaped him from the inside out. After that, it was us, building, adjusting, learning how to continue being a family after the center of it disappeared. We did that together. That's what made the distance so precise once it started. I knew exactly what we had, so I knew exactly what was leaving. And it didn't happen all at once. That's important. People always expect betrayal to arrive loudly, but most times it comes quietly enough to be mistaken for ordinary life at first. It was erosion, not explosion. The Sunday calls shifted from weekly to every other week, then once a month. Then whenever Clifton remembered, which slowly became less and less often. My birthday came and went last spring with a text message. 11 words. No call. I remember reading the message 3 separate times before setting my phone face down beside the coffee maker and continuing with my morning. Because what exactly is the alternative? At a certain age, dignity becomes instinctive. If you're listening to this late tonight or early in the morning somewhere, go ahead and tell me what time it is down in the comments. I always like knowing who's awake with me for these kinds of stories. The visits were worse. He'd promised to stop by and then something would happen. Work, emergency, traffic, exhaustion, last-minute plans. I stopped asking him to reschedule after the 3rd cancellation because I didn't want to become the kind of mother who turns herself into another obligation her son has to manage emotionally. So I gave him grace. At least that's what I told myself at the time. He's busy. He's building his life. He'll come back around. But grace has a weight to it people rarely discuss honestly. The longer you carry it without anything returning the other direction, the heavier it becomes. And by winter, I was carrying something that no longer felt like grace. It felt like loss, wearing patience as a disguise. The last time I called him before everything changed was a Tuesday evening. Nothing dramatic. I had been making soup and suddenly wanted to hear my son's voice the way mothers sometimes do for no reason beyond instinct. He answered after 4 rings. He was polite. That was the first thing that hurt me. Not cold, not rude, polite. Like a man speaking carefully to someone he no longer relaxes around naturally. He answered my questions, asked 1 or 2 of his own, paused in the correct places. But the entire conversation felt strangely hollow, like I was speaking to somebody performing familiarity instead of living inside it honestly. I kept waiting for him to arrive fully into the conversation the way he used to. That ease, that warmth, that unconscious closeness that exists between people who still feel emotionally safe with each other. It never came. At one point, I heard a woman's voice faintly in the background, and Clifton lowered his own voice immediately afterward, without explaining why. A small thing. Tiny. But mothers survive on tiny things. Then right before we hung up, I told him I missed him. There was a pause. Not long enough for most people to notice. Long enough for me. Then he said, "Yeah, things have just been busy lately." Yeah, not. I miss you too. I sat at my kitchen table for a long time after the call ended. Not crying, just thinking. Because something inside that conversation had unsettled me deeper than disappointment. This no longer felt like ordinary distance, or adulthood, or grief finally settling differently with age. It felt constructed, like somebody had slowly moved into the space between my son and me, and rearranged the furniture carefully enough that by the time I noticed, nothing inside the relationship was sitting where it used to anymore. And whoever had done it patiently. It was 2:17 in the morning when I stopped pretending I was going to sleep. I got up, wrapped myself in the robe Roosevelt Ashford bought me the Christmas before he passed, and sat in the chair by the window, not crying, not praying yet, just sitting with everything I had been too busy to look at directly. Because that is what the middle of the night does. It removes every excuse you've been using to avoid the thing you already know. I started going back. 3 months before the calls stopped coming regularly, Clifton had phoned on a Wednesday afternoon. Unusual for him, he was a Sunday caller, consistent as a clock. I remember being pleased by the surprise of it. We talked for maybe 10 minutes before I heard it. A laugh in the background. Soft, female. He shifted the phone and said it was the television. I let it go because I wanted to. That was my first mistake. Then there was the matter of his opinions. Clifton used to ask me things. What did I think about this decision, that opportunity, a conflict with someone at work? It wasn't dependence. It was the rhythm of a man who valued his mother's read on the world. Somewhere in the middle of last year that stopped completely. Not gradually. It simply stopped. And I noticed, but I filed it under growth, under independence, under him becoming more fully himself. I gave it a generous name and moved on. The comment that stayed with me longest came during one of our shorter calls in the fall. I had mentioned in passing that I'd love to come visit, see his place, take him to dinner. There was a pause before he said it wasn't a good time. But it wasn't the words. It was the layer underneath them, a firmness that didn't belong to him, like he was repeating something he'd been coached to say rather than answering from himself. I had heard that tone before, just never from my son. Kelvin had called twice in the past 6 weeks. Clifton's best friend since they were boys. Easy, warm, always quick with a joke. But both calls felt different from his usual check-ins. Lighter on the surface and heavier underneath. He asked how I was doing with the particular care of someone who already knows the answer isn't good. He didn't say Clifton's name either time, and I noticed that too. A man doesn't avoid his best friend's name in conversation with that friend's mother unless he's trying not to open something he isn't sure how to close. I sat with all of it in that chair until the sky outside began changing color. I know the difference between a son who is busy and a son who has been redirected. I know the difference between distance that comes from life moving fast and distance that has been constructed, built deliberately, maintained carefully, designed to keep me exactly where I was, on the outside of something I didn't have a name for yet. I have survived things in this life that would have finished other women. I survived them by refusing to look away from what was true, even when the truth was ugly and inconvenient and mine alone to carry. I was done looking away. I was going to call Clifton Ashford, not to accuse him, not to make a scene. But because I am his mother and I had spent enough months being patient and gracious and understanding. If I had done something wrong, I deserved to know what it was. And if I hadn't, then I deserved to know that too. He picked up on the third ring. Hey, Ma. Casual. Easy. Like we had spoken yesterday, like nothing between us had shifted at all. That voice, so familiar, so completely his, almost weakened my resolve for a second. Almost. Clifton. I kept my tone level. I need to talk to you about something and I need you to hear me out before you respond. A small pause. Okay. Something has changed between us, I said. I don't know exactly what it is, and I'm not calling to fight with you. I'm calling because I'm your mother, and I'd rather ask you directly than keep sitting here pretending I don't feel it. He exhaled softly into the phone. Ma, I've just been busy lately. Work has been a lot, and Clifton. I only said his name once, quietly, but he stopped talking immediately. I'm not talking about busy, I said. I know what busy sounds like. I know what stress sounds like. This is something else. Silence. Not empty silence either. Decision-making silence. The kind where you can hear another person choosing which version of the truth they're willing to hand you. Then finally, I've been meaning to tell you something. My grip tightened slightly around the phone. What? I'm engaged. The word landed between us and stayed there. Engaged. My son was engaged. Not dating someone seriously, not thinking about marriage someday. Engaged. A proposal had happened. Families had likely met. Plans had been made. Conversations had unfolded over months, and somehow none of them had included me. And I was hearing about it now, like I was some distant relative being updated out of obligation. I kept my voice steady. How long? Another pause. Almost a year. Almost a year. 12 months of holidays, weekends, dinners, conversations, photographs, memories. An entire hidden life existing just outside my reach. Not because he forgot to mention it, because he made the choice not to. When is the wedding, Clifton? He knew immediately that I was no longer asking casually. The silence before his answer stretched long enough that I became aware of my own heartbeat inside my chest. Slow, heavy, controlled. 1, 2, 3. Then he sighed. Ma. His tone shifted slightly. Careful now, measured. Ardenine's family is different. I said nothing. The people coming to this wedding are professors, attorneys, people in certain circles. Her mother is very particular about the environment and the kind of event she wants. He gave a short, awkward laugh that sounded rehearsed halfway through it. It's very formal. Still, I said nothing. Then he added quietly, You probably wouldn't feel comfortable there. That sentence landed worse than shouting would have, because shouting is emotional. Shouting can be regretted. This sounded prepared. I tightened my fingers around the phone. What does that mean? Another pause. This one shorter, like he'd already crossed the hardest part internally. Then he said it. It's only for educated people. Not angry. Not cruel in tone. Worse, flat, reasonable. Like he had repeated the sentence enough times somewhere else that it no longer sounded ugly to him anymore. Like somebody had sanded the humanity off it before he ever brought it to me. I closed my eyes slowly. And suddenly, another memory surfaced without warning. 3 years earlier. Clifton, standing in my kitchen after meeting Ardenine's mother for the first time. He had laughed nervously while fixing his tie in the reflection of my microwave door. They're just different, Ma, he'd said back then. Real, polished people. At the time, I thought he sounded impressed. Now, sitting there with that phone pressed against my ear, I realized he had sounded intimidated. I remembered another moment too. Months later. A short phone call where he mentioned taking Ardenine to one of my church fish fries when she first moved to the city. I had asked how she liked it. He hesitated before answering. She said everybody was nice. Everybody was nice. Not the food, not the music, not the people themselves. like she had visited somewhere cultural instead of somewhere human. I hadn't thought much about it then. Now those little moments returned wearing different clothes, and underneath all of it, I could suddenly hear something else very clearly. My son had not arrived at this sentence alone. It's only for educated people. There are insults people throw in anger that disappear once the anger burns off. Then there are insults that arrive already organized, repeated privately until the speaker no longer recognizes the cruelty living inside them. This was the second kind. What stayed with me most afterward wasn't even the sentence itself. It was how naturally he carried it. No stumble, no shame, no moment where he hurt himself and pulled back. He said it like a man repeating a conclusion he had slowly been taught to accept. My son said that to me. The woman who worked double shifts after Roosevelt Ashford died so he could finish school without debt. The woman who sat in emergency rooms with him. The woman who learned how to grieve quietly so he would have enough room to grieve loudly. For one brief moment, I almost asked him the question sitting at the center of my chest. Who taught you to be ashamed of me? But I already knew the answer would hurt more than the silence. So instead, I sat there breathing carefully into a kitchen that suddenly did not feel like my own anymore. Then I said very calmly, "I hear you, Clifton." And I ended the call myself. I didn't throw the phone, didn't call him back, didn't cry. I simply sat in my kitchen chair, the same chair I had sat in 2 nights earlier, turning memories over in the dark. And I let the words remain in the room with me because they deserved to be felt fully before I decided what to do with them. You wouldn't feel comfortable there, only for educated people. My son said that to his mother. And the worst part was not the insult. It was how completely natural he had made it sound. Morning came and I was still here. I don't say that lightly. There are kinds of pain that make you question your own durability sometime around 3 in the morning. The kind that sits at the foot of your bed, asking whether you truly have enough left in you to stand back up and meet another day, carrying the same heart inside your chest. I met it anyway. I got out of bed, washed my face, made my coffee. Then I stood at my kitchen window, watching the morning arrive the way it always does. Slowly, indifferently, completely unconcerned with whatever human heartbreak happened in this house the night before. The light moved across the counter. The refrigerator hummed. Somebody down the street started a lawnmower, ordinary life continuing itself. I did not call anyone. I did not replay the conversation with Clifton searching for some hidden softness I might have missed the first time around. I did not invent alternate versions where he caught himself before saying the words, or apologized immediately after they left his mouth. I simply stood there and allowed myself to be a woman who had just been told she was not educated enough to attend her own son's wedding. Then I went to work on the inside. Not self-pity. I want to be clear about that. What I did that morning was closer to inventory. Because when somebody reduces you to something small long enough, you owe it to yourself to quietly remember the full size of what you actually are. I raised Clifton alone after Roosevelt Ashford passed. Worked 2 jobs the first year because I refused to let my son drag debt behind him into adulthood if I could help it. I sat through late-night fevers, heartbreaks, college stress, job disappointments, funerals, panic, uncertainty, all the ordinary and extraordinary things that make up another human life. I was never a perfect mother. There are decisions I would revise if God handed me the years back differently. But I was present, consistently, quietly, without performance. I loved my child in the unglamorous ways that actually sustain people. Food in the refrigerator, tuition paid on time, gas money slipped into a coat pocket before he had to ask, staying awake until headlights pulled safely into the driveway. The kind of love people rarely notice while they're receiving it, because it has arranged itself so completely around their life that they mistake it for air. One day, he will understand that. One day, if he becomes a parent himself, he'll realize love at that level does not announce itself loudly. It simply keeps showing up, again and again, long after applause would have stopped sustaining anybody else. I let myself have that truth. Then I moved toward the part I did not understand. The fiancé, Ardenine. Now that I had her name, I found myself repeating it silently while rinsing my coffee cup. Ardenine. I knew almost nothing else. Not what she looked like, not what kind of work she did, not how she laughed, not what city she grew up in. My son had managed to keep an entire human being sealed completely outside the borders of my life for nearly a year. That takes effort. Intentional effort. I didn't resent her yet. A woman does not automatically earn my resentment simply because my son fell in love with her. But I thought about what she knew, or more specifically, what she had been told. Because men do not wake up one morning ashamed of their mothers in isolation. Shame like that develops slowly around conversation, around implication, around repeated suggestions, small enough to survive unnoticed while they settle into somebody's thinking permanently. Little corrections, little embarrassments, little distinctions between us and them. I found myself remembering things differently now. 6 months earlier, Clifton had invited me to lunch downtown after one of his work conferences. He arrived late because he had been meeting Ardenine's mother beforehand. I remembered asking casually how she was. And I remembered Clifton smiling awkwardly before saying, "She's very accomplished." At the time, I thought nothing of it. Now I wondered why that had been the very first word he reached for. Accomplished. Not kind, not warm, not funny. Accomplished. Then another memory surfaced. I had once mailed Clifton homemade peach cobbler around the holidays, his favorite since childhood. 2 days later, he thanked me over the phone but sounded strangely distracted. Finally, he admitted softly, almost laughing, "Ardenine said nobody she knows still bakes from scratch like this anymore." At the time, I took it as harmless surprise. Standing in my kitchen now, I heard the sentence differently. Not cruel, exactly. Worse. Observational. The way people talk when they're studying another class of person from a distance. I dried my hands slowly against the dish towel. And then another thought arrived. Quietly. Without warning. Who introduced them? Not where they met. Not how long they had dated. Who placed them in the same room and stepped back? Because relationships hidden this carefully do not hide themselves accidentally. Somebody decided early that I should remain outside whatever this was. Somebody helped construct that distance before I even realized distance was being built. I stood there holding my coffee while another memory rose up beside it before I could stop it. Gwendolyn. I had not spoken her name aloud in over 20 years. 23 years earlier, she sat across from me in a restaurant booth with both hands wrapped around a sweating glass of water and told me she was pregnant. Roosevelt Ashford had confessed the affair 2 nights before. I remember studying her face while she spoke and thinking she looked smaller than I expected guilt to make a person look. Fragile almost. Not triumphant. Not apologetic enough either. Just frightened and exhausted, and too far inside the consequences to climb back out cleanly anymore. She told me the baby was a girl. Months later, I saw the child once outside a grocery store. Curly hair tied back with pink ribbons. Gwendolyn lifting her from the shopping cart seat while pretending not to notice me standing across the parking lot. But that was not truly the last time I saw her. Years later, maybe 15 years ago now, I attended a church scholarship banquet downtown with one of my co-workers. During the reception, I looked across the room and saw Gwendolyn near the dessert table. beside a teenage girl in a pale blue dress. The girl was laughing at something somebody had said. I remember noticing two things at once: how pretty she was, and how violently familiar the angle of her smile felt for one brief, unsettling second. Roosevelt Ashford's mouth. Not identical. Just enough to disturb me. Gwendolyn saw me looking, and the expression that crossed her face lasted less than a heartbeat before disappearing again. But I never forgot it because it was not embarrassment. It was fear. After that, we returned to silence. No friendship, no shared holidays, no accidental reunions, just a hard, clean separation both of us maintained without ever discussing it directly. I removed her from my life completely, and she stayed gone. Until now. I didn't yet understand why those memories had returned standing there in my kitchen. I only knew something underneath this situation had started moving long before Clifton ever picked up that phone. And for the first time since our conversation ended, I felt something settle quietly beside the hurt inside me. Not anger, something colder, something watchful. My phone buzzed on a Thursday afternoon and Kelvin's name came up on the screen. I almost let it go to voicemail. Not because I didn't want to talk to him. Kelvin had always been easy, the kind of young man who made a room feel lighter just by being in it. But I was still carrying the weight of that phone call with Clifton. And I wasn't sure I had the energy to perform fine for someone who might ask how I was doing. And actually mean it. I picked up anyway. Miss Ernestine. His voice was warm, familiar. The same way he'd spoken to me since he was 17 years old, sitting at my kitchen table, eating whatever I had made that evening. Just wanted to check in on you. I'm here, I said. Which was true, if not complete. We talked the way we used to. Easy, without agenda. He asked about my garden, mentioned a mutual memory, laughed at something small. But underneath the warmth, I felt it. The same thing I had heard in his previous calls. A carefulness. A man measuring his words not because he was being dishonest, but because he was carrying something he hadn't figured out how to hand over yet. I let the conversation breathe. I didn't push. I have learned in this life that the truth arrives faster when you don't chase it. Miss Ernestine, he said finally, and the shift in his tone was small, but I caught it. Can I ask you something straight? You can always ask me straight, Kelvin. Has Clifton talked to you? About what's happening with him? He has, I said carefully. Some of it. Another pause. Then, the wedding is in 3 weeks. I don't think you know where it is. The room got very quiet. I didn't respond immediately, and he took that as permission to continue. It was set up that way, he said, deliberately. My fingers tightened slightly around the phone. A few of us asked him why you weren't coming. Kelvin continued carefully. At first he kept dodging it. Then one night after drinks, he finally said Ardenine's family wanted the wedding small and a certain type of environment. I heard the discomfort in his voice even now. He said it wasn't really your scene. Not your scene. The polished version of the same insult. You were never supposed to know the venue, he said quietly. Then I heard him make a decision. It's at Hargrove Hall, off Montclair Avenue, Saturday the 14th, 2 o'clock. I wrote it down even though I knew I wouldn't forget it. Kelvin. I kept my voice steady. Why are you telling me this? He exhaled slowly. Because I've been watching him. His voice dropped lower. And none of this feels real. I stayed quiet. A few weeks ago, we were in the car and one of those old soul songs you used to play came on. The ones y'all used to clean the house to when we were kids. A small, humorless laugh escaped him. Clifton reached over and cut it off so fast it almost scared me. He paused. But before he did, I saw his face. Something in my chest shifted. That's not a man who stopped loving his mother, Kelvin said softly. That's a man trying real hard to become somebody else, because somebody convinced him the old version of himself wasn't good enough anymore. He said it carefully, like he had been carrying it around for weeks, trying to decide whether saying it out loud would betray his friend or save him. I kept thinking he'd come to his senses before the wedding, he admitted. But every time your name came up, he got colder. Not angry, just rehearsed. That word stayed with me. Rehearsed. If you show up, Kelvin said quietly, I think something in him will crack. I really do. I didn't answer immediately. Not because I disagreed, because part of me was afraid he might be right. I told him I appreciated him. I told him he was a good friend. And then I got off the phone and sat at my kitchen table with a piece of paper in front of me. Hargrove Hall, Montclair Avenue, Saturday the 14th, 2:00. A door had just opened in front of me. I sat there with my hand resting beside that paper for a long time, not walking through the door, not walking away from it either, just sitting with the weight of a choice I had not made yet, and the quiet certainty that whichever direction I chose, nothing after it would remain untouched. The piece of paper sat on my kitchen table for 2 days. I didn't hide it, didn't fold it or tuck it under something. I left it exactly where I had written it down, and I lived around it, made my meals, read my Bible, watered my plants. And every time I passed through that kitchen, it was there. Hargrove Hall, Montclair Avenue, Saturday the 14th, 2:00, just sitting there, waiting for me to decide what kind of woman I was going to be. I thought about walking away first, gave it the full consideration it deserved because it wasn't a coward's option. It was a dignified one. My son had made himself clear. He was an adult making adult choices, and there was an argument to be made that respecting those choices, even the ones that cut you, was its own form of strength. I could stay home. I could let him have his day. I could preserve what was left of my pride and wait to see if time and distance eventually returned him to me. I sat with that option honestly, turned it over, looked at it from every angle. Then I thought about what I would be walking away from. Not a party, not a seat at a table I hadn't been offered. I would be walking away from a moment in my son's life that could not be revisited. The day he stood before people and made the most significant promise of his life. A moment his children would one day hear about. A moment that would exist in photographs and memories, and the permanent record of who this family was. I would be absent from it, not because I couldn't be there, because I had been told I wasn't enough to be there. And I have never, not once in my life, accepted someone else's definition of what I am worth. I have never forced myself into a room. That is true. I am not a woman who pushes through doors that are clearly closed to her, or makes scenes in public spaces, or demands attention she hasn't earned. But there is a difference between forcing yourself into a room and simply refusing to be erased from your own son's life. I knew that difference in my bones. He said I wasn't educated enough. I raised him. I fed him. I sat with him in hospital waiting rooms and carried his grief when it was too heavy for him to lift alone. I built a life with my own hands after the man we both loved left us without warning. I did all of that without asking anyone to applaud me for it. And now I was supposed to disappear because someone had decided I didn't meet the standard. No, not out of anger. I want to be precise about that. Anger is loud, and I had moved past loud, not out of strategy either. I wasn't going to Hargrove Hall to prove a point or reclaim anything or make Clifton regret a single word he'd said to me. I was going because I am his mother. I have been his mother every single day of his life, and I have not stopped being that for one breath, 1 hour, 1 moment, not even during the months he made it clear he'd rather I didn't exist in his orbit. A mother doesn't expire. I folded the piece of paper, placed it in my Bible, and went to find something suitable to wear to my son's wedding. I woke up at 5:43. The alarm was set for 7. For a few seconds, I stayed still beneath the covers, staring at the ceiling while my body caught up to the day waiting for it. There are mornings when something significant arrives before your thoughts fully organize around it. Your chest knows first. Your breathing knows first. Your stomach knows first. This was one of those mornings. I got out of bed quietly, not because there was anyone else in the house to wake, because I already understood that everything about today required steadiness, deliberate movement, the kind you use when your decision has already been made and all that remains is to walk yourself through it carefully enough not to lose your nerve halfway there. I made coffee first, same mug, same chair, same slow process. Routine is an anchor, and I needed anchoring today. I carried the cup to the kitchen window and watched the neighborhood wake up around me in that ordinary, unhurried way Saturday mornings always do. A man walking his dog past the mailbox cluster. Somebody backing slowly out of a driveway. A child riding a bicycle too fast down the sidewalk while a woman called after him to slow down before he hit the corner. The world continuing itself completely unaware that somewhere across the city, my son was preparing to get married without me. I drank my coffee slowly. My stomach felt tight and unsettled in a way I recognized from funerals and hospital waiting rooms. I managed half a piece of toast because I knew driving on an empty stomach would make the shaking worse later, and I did not intend to arrive at Hargrove Hall looking fragile. Then I went to get dressed. The dress hanging at the end of my closet was deep plum. Not flashy, not mournful either. Structured, elegant, quietly expensive in the way clothes become when they've been chosen carefully instead of loudly. When I put it on and stood fully upright, it communicated exactly what I needed it to communicate. That I belonged anywhere I chose to stand. That I had not spent my life shrinking myself for other people's comfort. I fastened the pearls Roosevelt Ashford gave me on our 15th anniversary and paused briefly at the mirror while securing the clasp. The memory arrived unexpectedly then. Roosevelt Ashford standing behind me in this same bedroom all those years ago, fastening those pearls around my neck himself because my nails were wet, and I kept smudging them trying to do it alone. "You always rush everything." He'd laughed softly against my shoulder. I closed my eyes for 1 second after the memory passed, then opened them again. Because today was not the day to fall backward into ghosts. I studied my reflection quietly. The lines that had not been there 20 years ago. The eyes that had seen more than they were ever supposed to. The mouth that had learned over time that dignity and silence are not the same thing. I did not give myself a speech. I am not that kind of woman. I simply made a quiet agreement with the woman standing in front of me. That we were enough. That we had always been enough. And that nothing said over a telephone by a man trying too hard to become somebody else could change that fact. I picked up my bag and left the house. The drive to Hargrove Hall took 31 minutes. I know because I watched the dashboard clock in a way I normally don't. Not anxiously exactly, precisely. I took the longer route intentionally, through the older parts of the city where the trees still arched over the streets and the houses carried character instead of size. I needed the drive to feel physical. Something I was moving through emotionally instead of simply enduring until arrival. At a red light near Montclair Avenue, I caught myself gripping the steering wheel too tightly and loosened my hands consciously afterward. Breathe. Just breathe. I thought about Clifton during that drive. Not the phone call, not the insult. Him. The little boy who used to drag blankets into my room during thunderstorms, pretending he was only there to watch television. The teenager who stayed up all night studying at the kitchen table with headphones around his neck and cereal bowls everywhere. The grown man who once called every Sunday without fail because hearing his mother's voice had remained part of his understanding of home. I held on to that version of him gently while driving because somewhere deep down, I understood that once I walked into Hargrove Hall, I would need both hands emotionally free. I pulled into the parking area at 1:47, 13 minutes early. The venue looked exactly the way wealthy event spaces always look on wedding days. Polished stone entrance, careful landscaping, luxury cars lined neatly across the lot like part of the decor itself. I turned off the engine, but didn't get out immediately. Instead, I sat there with both hands resting in my lap, listening to the silence inside the car. Through the windshield, I watched guests making their way toward the entrance dressed in soft neutrals and dark tailored suits. Comfortable people, invited people, people carrying themselves with the easy, unconscious confidence of belonging somewhere without needing to question it. For one brief, dangerous second, I felt the old instinct rise inside me. Leave. Just leave quietly. Preserve what dignity remains and go home before somebody humiliates you publicly. My hand actually moved toward the ignition again. Then I remembered Clifton's voice. Only for educated people. Something inside me settled immediately after that. Not anger. Clarity. I let one full minute pass. Then through the closed windows, I heard it faintly for the first time. Music drifting from somewhere inside the building. Soft piano and strings. The kind played before ceremonies begin, while everything still exists in possibility instead of consequence. I opened the car door slowly. The afternoon air hit my skin warm and steady. I stood upright beside the car, smoothed the front of my dress carefully with both hands, lifted my chin, and then I walked toward the entrance of Hargrove Hall like I had every right to be there. Because I did. The doors opened and the sound reached me before anything else did. Not loud, elegant, soft strings, low conversation. The particular hum of a room full of people gathered for something they believe is beautiful. I stood at the threshold for exactly 1 second, and then I walked in. Hargrove Hall was everything the name suggested. High ceilings, tall floral arrangements in ivory and deep green, rows of dressed chairs filling toward a decorated altar at the far end. The kind of room that had been prepared with care and money and intention. My son had built himself a life I had not been permitted to see, and standing in the middle of the evidence of it was its own particular experience. I took it in without slowing my steps. I moved through the space the way I had taught myself to move through rooms that weren't expecting me, with enough composure that the uncertainty belonged to everyone else and not to me. I kept my chin level, my hands still, my eyes forward. The recognition came in waves. A woman near the third row, someone from Clifton's old neighborhood, looked up, and her expression moved from welcome to confusion in the span of a single second. A man standing near the side wall saw me and glanced away too quickly, the way people do when they know something and aren't sure what their knowing obligates them to do. I registered each face and kept moving. I found a position along the side wall with a clear sightline to the altar, and I settled there, not hiding, not announcing myself, simply present in the way that a woman is present when she has decided that her presence is not negotiable. That was when Clifton saw me. He was standing near the front, turned slightly to speak with someone beside him, and then something made him look up. Instinct, maybe. Or the particular frequency that exists between a mother and her child, regardless of how much distance has been constructed between them. His eyes found me across that room, and everything in his face moved at once. Shock first, Then something harder and faster. Anger, or the performance of it. The kind that rises quickly in a man who has been caught between two things he cannot reconcile. And then, underneath both of those, something else. Something that lasted only a fraction of a second before he pushed it back down. I recognized it because I had seen it in his face his entire life. He missed me. He took one step in my direction. I did not move toward him. I held his gaze and I put everything I had into that look. Every year, every sacrifice, every morning I had chosen to love him without condition or audience. I am your mother. I am here. Someone called his name from the front. Sharp, redirecting. His head turned, and when he looked back at me, the moment had fractured. The officiant was moving into position. The wedding party was assembling. The room was transitioning from gathering to ceremony with the quiet efficiency of an event that had been planned down to the minute. Clifton was pulled forward. I stayed where I was. The music shifted, softer now, more deliberate. Guests settled into their seats. The room drew itself into the held-breath stillness that comes just before something begins. I stood along that wall in my burgundy dress with Roosevelt Ashford's pearls at my throat, and I was calm. The bride had not yet appeared. The music changed, and every person in that room turned toward the entrance. I turned with them. There is a particular shift that happens inside a wedding venue in the seconds before a bride appears. Something collective, involuntary. The entire room drawing breath together without discussing it first. Hargrove Hall did exactly that. The strings softened into the processional. Guests straightened in their seats. A whisper near the front got immediately hushed. The closed doors at the far end of the hall suddenly became the center of every eye in the room, and the anticipation around them felt almost physical. I watched them too. The doors opened slowly. Light from the foyer spilled across the polished floor ahead of her. And then she appeared. The room responded the way rooms always respond to a bride. A soft, collective exhale moving through the guests almost unconsciously. She was beautiful. There is no reason to lie about that. The dress was elegant without trying too hard. Fitted cleanly through the waist, soft beneath it. White flowers in her hands. Controlled breathing. Careful steps. The face of a young woman trying very hard not to cry before reaching the altar. And for one suspended second, I was simply looking at my son's bride. Then something inside me shifted. Not violently at first. Recognition rarely arrives dramatically in real life. Most times it starts as discomfort. A small wrongness your body notices before your mind catches up. My fingers tightened slowly around my purse, because suddenly there was something familiar about her face. Not familiar the way strangers sometimes resemble people you've known. Deeper than that. The line of her mouth. The shape of her eyes. Something in the way her expression settled between breaths. My pulse stumbled once inside my chest. And before I could fully place why, another memory surfaced without permission. A church scholarship banquet 15 years earlier. A teenage girl in a pale blue dress standing beside Gwendolyn Covington near a dessert table, laughing at something somebody had said. I remembered staring too long because something about the girl's smile had unsettled me even then. Not enough to form a conclusion. Just enough to stay behind, in my memory afterward. The bride took another step down the aisle. Then another memory hit. A grocery store parking lot 23 years ago. Pink ribbons tied into curly hair. Gwendolyn lifting a little girl from a shopping cart while pretending not to notice me standing across the lot, staring at them both. The room around me started feeling strangely distant. Not blurred yet, just farther away than it had been a moment earlier. I looked harder at the bride's face, and then she turned slightly while walking. That was when Roosevelt Ashford appeared. Not all of him. Not some impossible identical resemblance that only exists in television dramas. Something much smaller, much more intimate, which made it infinitely worse. The angle of her brow lifting before looking up. The exact tightening at one corner of her mouth when too many eyes were on her at once. A nervous habit. Roosevelt Ashford used to do the same thing at church anniversaries whenever somebody called him unexpectedly to the podium. Tiny movement. Barely noticeable unless you loved him long enough to catalog the unconscious things. I had. My stomach dropped so suddenly I had to steady myself against the side of the chair beside me. Heat rushed out of my body all at once. No. My mind said the word immediately. No. But memory had already started connecting itself faster than I could interrupt it. Gwendolyn's daughter, the teenage girl from the banquet, the child from the grocery store, Roosevelt Ashford's daughter, walking down the aisle toward Clifton. My son. A sharp pressure slammed into the center of my chest so hard, I genuinely thought for one terrifying second that I might collapse right there in the middle of Hargrove Hall. The edges of the room tilted slightly. I locked my knees instinctively to steady myself. Somebody near the front smiled toward the bride. A woman dabbed tears carefully beneath her eyes. The officiant adjusted his posture. Normal wedding movements continuing all around me while something catastrophic rearranged itself inside my body. And then came the final realization. Not emotional. Practical. Ardenine Covington. Covington. Not Ashford. Roosevelt. Ashford never publicly acknowledged her, never gave her his surname, never brought her into our world, which meant Clifton would have had no reason to connect her to his father, no reason to suspect anything beyond a woman he met through social circles carefully arranged around him. And if Gwendolyn kept Roosevelt Ashford's name buried inside her house all these years, dear God. I looked at the bride again. Really looked. And I knew immediately she did not know. There was no fear in her face, no calculation, no performance, just nerves, happiness, love. The fragile, glowing expression of a woman standing at what she believes is the beginning of her life. She was innocent. That realization tore through me harder than the rest of it. Because innocence meant somebody else carried the truth already. Somebody else had known exactly what this was while allowing her to walk toward it anyway. My eyes moved through the seated guests before my thoughts had fully formed. Searching. And then I saw her. Fourth row, left side, Gwendolyn Covington. Still. Too still. Not emotional like the other mothers in the room. Not teary-eyed. Not smiling proudly. Watching. Just watching. Watching her daughter walk toward my son with a face so controlled it stopped being natural. And in that instant, every remaining doubt inside me died completely. My body reacted before my mind did. My breathing shortened sharply, my chest tightened. A violent wave of nausea rolled upward so suddenly I covered my mouth with one hand. The room tilted again. I remember hearing the music continue for another 2 or 3 seconds while my body fought desperately to contain what my mind had finally understood. But there are truths the human body rejects before dignity has time to intervene. The sound that tore out of me came from somewhere beneath thought itself, beneath restraint, beneath pride, beneath 23 years of silence packed down so tightly I had almost convinced myself it no longer existed. It ripped out of my chest before I could stop it. A raw, broken scream that didn't even sound human to my own ears. The music stopped instantly. Somebody gasped. A chair scraped violently across the floor. Every head in the room turned toward me at once, and the entire wedding went still. The silence lasted 3 full seconds. I know because I counted them without meaning to. 1, 2, 3. And inside those 3 seconds, the entire room existed in suspension, like a glass knocked from the edge of a table that has not yet reached the floor. Every face turned toward me. Every body frozen exactly where it had been when that sound tore out of my chest. The bride stood motionless in the aisle, clutching her flowers. The officiant remained beside the altar with one hand half raised from the ceremony book. My son stood at the front, staring at me like he no longer recognized what he was looking at. Nobody moved. Then the glass hit the floor. The room broke in pieces instead of all at once. A bridesmaid near the front grabbed the arm of the woman beside her instinctively, like her body needed something solid before her mind understood why. Somebody in the back stood too quickly and struck a chair hard enough for it to scrape violently across the polished floor. A low wave of whispers spread unevenly through the guests, confused, frightened, curious, not understanding yet, just reacting. A man near the center aisle frowned toward me before looking around the room, searching for context somebody else might already possess. An older woman 2 rows ahead of me slowly turned toward Gwendolyn, with recognition beginning to form across her face. That mattered, because now the room wasn't only reacting to my scream anymore. It was beginning to connect people, names, history, age, timing. I saw it happening in fragments across the crowd. And then Clifton started moving toward me, fast, not with concern, not with the softness of a son trying to reach his frightened mother, with controlled fury, the kind that comes from humiliation arriving publicly before somebody has time to contain it. I watched him cross the room toward me, and for the first time in his life, there was something in his face I had never seen before. Not anger, exactly. Something colder, a hardness that did not belong naturally to him. The face of a gentle man who had practiced becoming emotionally unreachable because somebody convinced him softness was weakness. He stopped directly in front of me. But before he spoke, I looked past him one more time. Ardenine had stopped walking completely. She still held her flowers with both hands, but her fingers had tightened around the stems hard enough that several petals had bent beneath her grip. Her face had not reached understanding yet. That was the terrible part. She was still standing in the space between confusion and truth, open, vulnerable, waiting for somebody to explain why an older woman had just screamed at the sight of her walking toward the altar. There was no performance in her expression. No guilt, no fear. She genuinely did not know. Then my eyes moved farther left, toward the 4th row, toward Gwendolyn Covington, and suddenly the room around her made sense in a way it hadn't 30 seconds earlier, because everybody else was reacting. Everybody else was whispering or turning or shifting or searching somebody else's face for explanation. But not Gwendolyn. She sat perfectly still. Too still, hands folded tightly in her lap, back straight, face controlled, not shocked, not confused, controlled. And I realized with absolute certainty that I was looking at a woman who had rehearsed this possibility in her mind long before today. Maybe not this exact moment, maybe not my scream, but exposure, discovery, collapse. She had prepared internally for survival long before she walked into Hargrove Hall. Our eyes met fully, for the first time in over 20 years. And something passed across her face then. Not surprise, recognition, fear, real fear. Not fear for herself either. Fear because she knew immediately that I knew. And that meant the lie had reached the end of itself. She looked away first. Clifton reached me a second later. "What are you doing?" Not a question. A demand forced quietly through clenched teeth. "You need to leave. Right now." His voice was low enough that he clearly believed only I could hear him. But tension changes volume inside a room. People nearby had already fallen silent, trying to listen without appearing obvious about it. The wedding guests were watching us now. The officiant was watching. The musicians had lowered their instruments completely. Ardenine was watching from the center aisle with growing fear in her eyes. And Gwendolyn was watching without appearing to. I looked at my son. Really looked at him. My child. The little boy who used to fall asleep against my shoulder during long church services. The teenager who cried in the hospital hallway after Roosevelt Ashford died because he thought grief made him weak if anybody saw it directly. The grown man who once called me every Sunday just to hear my voice while eating leftovers in his apartment. And standing in front of me now was that same boy inside a body, trying desperately to become somebody harder. "You are embarrassing me," he whispered sharply. The words hit me strangely, not because they hurt worse than the phone call, because suddenly I understood something terrifying. He still believed this moment could be controlled if I simply cooperated long enough. He still thought the disaster in this room was my behavior, not the truth itself. And behind him, Ardenine shifted slightly where she stood in the aisle. I saw her eyes move between my face and Gwendolyn's, then toward Clifton, then back toward me again. Searching. Her breathing had changed now. Faster. Because some deep instinct inside her had finally realized this room contained information about her life that everybody else somehow understood before she did. A man near the front suddenly said quietly to the woman beside him, "Covington?" Very softly, but in a silent room, softly travels. The woman beside him looked immediately toward Gwendolyn, then toward Ardenine, then slowly toward Clifton. And I watched realization begin crawling through another face. The room was starting to wake up. Clifton stepped closer to me. "Ma," he hissed, "please, please." Not because he thought I was wrong, because he was afraid. And underneath all his anger and embarrassment and rehearsed coldness, I saw it clearly, for the first time since entering Hargrove Hall. He had no idea what was happening. None. Which meant the only people who walked into this room carrying the full truth were me. And Gwendolyn Covington. The weight of 23 years shifted heavily inside my chest then. All the silence, all the buried humiliation, all the decisions made in darkness and carried alone afterward. I felt it rise inside me like something that had finally reached the surface after decades underwater. I opened my mouth. I did not raise my voice. There was no need to. The room was already silent, and I have learned in this life that the most devastating things are usually said quietly. Volume is for people uncertain they'll be believed. I looked only at Clifton. Clifton. His name came out steady despite the pressure building in my chest. "I need you to listen to me. Not as the man standing at this altar. Not as the man angry at me for being here. As my son. Just for the next few minutes. As my son." Something shifted across his face, not softness, but movement. He didn't speak. I swallowed once before continuing. "Your father had an affair." The words landed heavily between us. A murmur moved somewhere behind me and disappeared almost immediately. I kept going before my courage could break apart underneath me. I found out 23 years ago. The woman he was involved with was my best friend, Gwendolyn Covington. I said her name, and for the first time since entering that room, I heard an actual sound come from the guests. A low, stunned reaction spreading unevenly through the chairs. Clifton's eyes flickered toward the left side of the room instinctively. Toward her. Then back to me. "I found out about the pregnancy, too," I said, and this time my voice nearly failed me halfway through the sentence. I stopped for one breath. Just one. "She told me herself." My fingers had curled tightly around each other without me realizing it. "You had just lost your father back then," I continued more quietly. "You were 19, grieving, angry at the world one day, and barely speaking the next. And I I stopped again because suddenly I could see him at 19 so clearly it hurt. Thin from grief. Sleeping on the couch because Roosevelt Ashford's side of the house felt too empty. I forced myself forward. I made a decision. Maybe the right one, maybe not. But it was mine. The room remained completely still. I decided you deserved to keep whatever version of your father was helping you survive losing him. So I stayed quiet. I cut Gwendolyn out of my life completely, and I carried the rest by myself. Clifton's mouth had opened slightly now. Not in argument, in disbelief. I could see him trying to fit this information into the shape of the life he thought he understood. That baby was a girl, I said softly. I knew that much. I saw her once or twice when she was little, never spoke to her, never knew her name. I kept my distance because none of this belonged to her. She was innocent. I looked past Clifton then. At Ardenine, still standing in the aisle, holding her flowers with both hands like she no longer understood what they were for. And something inside me cracked a little wider at the sight of her. When I spoke again, my voice came rougher than before. The young woman standing there? I paused because suddenly the sentence felt too terrible to say cleanly. Clifton. That girl is Roosevelt Ashford's daughter. The words fell into the room like something heavy breaking through water. She is your father's child. Clifton stared at me. I watched the understanding begin trying to form behind his eyes and fail the first time it reached for shape. Then I said the part that finally shattered him. Which means, she is your sister. Nobody moved. Nobody even breathed correctly. I looked at Ardenine again and felt my throat tighten unexpectedly. I do not believe that child knew, I said, quieter now. I don't. I believe she walked into this room innocent. Then slowly, finally, I turned my head toward the fourth row, toward Gwendolyn. But her mother knew. The silence afterward did not feel normal anymore. It felt alive, pressurized, like the room itself was struggling to hold the weight of what had just been placed inside it. Clifton's face had gone somewhere beyond shock now. Beyond anger, too. Into something emptier and far more frightening. Behind him, Ardenine still stood frozen in the aisle, flowers trembling slightly in her hands. And 4 rows back, Gwendolyn Covington sat perfectly still with her hands folded tightly in her lap and her eyes fixed somewhere above all of us. She had not moved, had not spoken, had not once looked at her daughter. Ardenine moved before anyone else did, not running, not stumbling. She walked, the same careful, deliberate walk she had carried down that aisle 2 minutes ago, still holding her flowers, her dress moving around her feet with every step. The room parted for her without being asked. People pulled back instinctively the way they do when they recognize that what is happening in front of them is too private and too large for them to be standing inside of. She walked past me without looking at me, past Clifton without looking at him. She walked directly to the 4th row on the left side, and she stopped in front of her mother. Gwendolyn looked up slowly. Ardenine stood there for a moment and just looked at the woman who raised her, taking in her face the way you look at something familiar that has just revealed itself to be something else entirely. Then she spoke. Why? One word. Quiet. Not accusatory, not yet. The kind of why that isn't looking for a simple answer because the person asking already understands that no simple answer exists. It was the why of someone standing at the edge of a drop they didn't know was there until this moment. Gwendolyn opened her mouth, then closed it. The room watched. Ardenine asked again. Same word, same volume, but something inside it had sharpened. More precise, more specific. Because she wasn't asking about the affair anymore. She had already absorbed that. What she was asking now was something that required her, Mother to look her in the face and account for a decision that had nothing to do with the past and everything to do with the deliberate construction of Ardenine's present. You knew who he was. Ardenine's voice was still low, controlled in the way that things are controlled just before they are not. You knew who his father was. You knew what that made him to me. And you still... She stopped, steadied herself. You pointed me toward him, Mama. You were there when we met. You never said a word. Gwendolyn's hands shifted in her lap. I did what I thought. Don't. Ardenine's voice didn't rise. It hardened. Don't tell me what you thought. Tell me what you knew. Tell me what you were planning, because I need to understand what I was to you in all of this. The silence that followed was the worst kind. The kind that contains an answer the speaker is still deciding how to dress before they deliver it. And then Gwendolyn spoke, quietly, without looking away from her daughter. And what came out of her mouth was worse than any denial would have been, because it was the truth, uncalculated and stripped of performance by the weight of the moment pressing down on her. She had known. She had always known. She had been in that room when they met, and she had said nothing and done nothing, because she had looked at Clifton Ashford and seen not a man her daughter was falling in love with, but a position, a name, a legal connection that, if the marriage held long enough, could eventually unlock what Roosevelt Ashford had never given Ardenine in life. Acknowledgement, acclaim, a share of something that had always belonged partly to her by blood and never by law. Ardenine's flowers hit the floor, not thrown, simply released. Her hands opened at her sides and they fell, and she did not look down at them. She was looking at her mother, and now she understood exactly what she had been brought here to be. The room had heard enough by then to begin assembling the truth for itself. Not perfectly. People rarely absorb something this catastrophic cleanly the first time it reaches them. But enough pieces had surfaced now that understanding was beginning to spread through Hargrove Hall, whether anyone wanted it to or not. I watched realization move across the guests the way weather crosses open land. Slowly at first, then all at once. One face changing, then another, then another. People turning quietly toward Gwendolyn, toward Ardenine, toward Clifton. The room no longer felt confused. It felt horrified. Gwendolyn was still seated, still upright. But the composure she arrived with had started thinning around the edges in ways she could no longer fully control. Her hands were no longer still in her lap. Her fingers kept tightening against each other unconsciously. Her eyes moved carefully around the room now, measuring exits, witnesses, judgment, damage. Too late for that. The damage had already happened. Clifton was the first person who spoke again. Not to the room exactly. To himself. Quietly. Like a man trying to rebuild the road beneath his feet while still standing on it. The restaurant? His voice sounded distant to his own ears. He stared somewhere past all of us, while memory rearranged itself in real time. The first dinner where we met. Nobody interrupted him. He swallowed hard. Gwendolyn organized it. I saw Ardenine's eyes shift slowly toward her mother. Clifton kept talking. There were maybe 10 people there, mutual friends. I remember she changed the seating at the last minute and put us beside each other. At the time, it had felt warm, natural, thoughtful. Now he heard the memory differently. Then another memory surfaced. The lake weekend, he said softly. Ardenine invited me after her mother kept saying I worked too much and needed to get away for a few days. His breathing shortened slightly. Then the dinners at her house. The questions. Questions about work. Questions about long-term plans. Questions about family property. Questions about Roosevelt Ashford. At the time, Clifton had mistaken it for parental interest. Now he heard strategy inside all of it. "I thought she was just trying to know who I was," he said quietly. Nobody answered him, because everyone in that room understood now that Gwendolyn had been doing exactly that. Learning him, assessing him, positioning him. Not for romance, for access. Clifton looked physically ill as realization, continued moving through him piece by piece. And then finally, for the first time since this entire nightmare began, Gwendolyn spoke. Not loudly, not theatrically, almost tired. "You think I wanted my daughter to struggle?" she asked quietly. Nobody moved. Her eyes stayed fixed on Clifton now, instead of me. Roosevelt Ashford walked away from her before she even had a chance to matter publicly. Her voice remained controlled, but something old and hardened had started surfacing underneath it now. "Do you understand what that does to a child? Watching another family carry the name, the stability, the legitimacy, while you sit outside all of it pretending it doesn't touch you." Ardenine stared at her mother like she no longer recognized the woman speaking. Gwendolyn kept going. "I watched your mother keep the house, keep the memories, keep the respectable version of Roosevelt Ashford people wanted to hold on to." She glanced briefly toward me before looking back at Clifton. "And my daughter got silence. A father who handled her privately, but never publicly enough to matter." The room remained frozen around her. "But I never intended—" She stopped herself briefly, breathing carefully now. "I never thought this would happen." That changed the room. Because up until then, people had been hearing a villain. Now they were hearing something more dangerous. A woman who convinced herself she could control consequences bigger than herself. "I knew Roosevelt Ashford never legally acknowledged Ardenine," Gwendolyn said carefully. "Different surname, different circles, different lives. Years had passed. I told myself there was no way either of them would ever know." Ardenine's face changed slowly as she listened. Not relief. Worse. Understanding. Because now she could finally see the shape of the lie her mother had built around her life. "I thought, if they built something real first," Gwendolyn continued weakly. "If they married. If Ardenine finally became part of the Ashford family publicly." "You mean if I became attached to the name first," Ardenine said quietly. Gwendolyn stopped. Ardenine took a slow step backward. "You looked at me and saw a solution." "No." "Yes." Ardenine's voice sharpened now, not louder, but clearer, stronger. "You decided where my life belonged before I ever got to choose it myself." "Ardenine." "You knew." Her breathing had turned uneven now. "Every dinner, every conversation, every time you smiled watching us together, you already knew." Tears finally gathered in Gwendolyn's eyes then, but it was too late for tears to soften anything. "I was trying to secure your future." "My future?" Ardenine stared at her mother in disbelief. "You let me fall in love with my brother." The word brother hit the room harder than anything else had so far. Not because people didn't already know, because hearing it spoken aloud made the horror impossible to mentally soften anymore. Gwendolyn closed her eyes briefly, like the sentence physically hurt to hear. But Ardenine wasn't finished. "You used me." Not screamed. Said. Quietly. Devastatingly. And for the first time since this began, Gwendolyn truly looked broken. Because there are moments when truth becomes too naked to dress back up once it has finally entered the room. Clifton had gone completely still near the altar. Then slowly he turned toward Ardenine. And what broke my heart in that moment was this. The love on his face was still there. God help him. It was still there. Whatever manipulation Gwendolyn had threaded underneath the relationship from the beginning, whatever self-deception she used to survive her own choices. Somewhere along the way, the feeling between those two children had become real. That was the tragedy underneath all the horror. None of this had been real to Gwendolyn, but it had become real to them. And now Clifton stood there carrying both truths at once, the betrayal and the love. The grief on his face was not anger anymore. It was loss, pure, helpless, absolute. And standing there watching both of those children break apart in front of us, I realized something terrible. There was no version of the truth that could save them now. The room emptied the way rooms do after something irreversible, gradually, without announcement. People finding their coats and their reasons and their exits with the careful quiet of those who understand they have witnessed something that does not belong to them. The wedding party went first, then the guests, in clusters, speaking low. The officiant gathered his things without making eye contact with anyone. The catering staff withdrew to the edges and then beyond them. Someone, I didn't see who, picked up Ardenine's flowers from the floor and placed them on a chair. Ardenine herself had been guided to a side room by a woman I didn't recognize, her face still carrying that particular hollowness of someone who has not yet begun to feel the full size of what happened to them. Gwendolyn left without speaking to anyone. I watched her go. And then it was Clifton and me. Not entirely alone, there were still staff moving at the periphery, still the residue of 100 people in the arrangement of the chairs and the flowers that had no wedding left to frame. But alone, enough. As close to alone as this moment was going to allow. He stood about 6 feet from me, and he looked at me. Not the way he had looked at me when he crossed the room in fury. Not the way he had looked at me across the years of managed distance. He looked at me the way he used to when he was young and something had happened that was bigger than he knew how to hold, with his full face, nothing guarded, working through it in real time without trying to hide the working. I let him look. I did not speak first. I did not offer him comfort he hadn't reached for yet or absolution he hadn't asked for. I simply stood in front of my son in my burgundy dress with Roosevelt Ashford's pearls at my throat, and I let him see me clearly, exactly as I was, exactly as I had always been, exactly as I had remained through every month he had allowed someone to convince him I wasn't worth the room I was standing in. He opened his mouth once, closed it. Then he said, "I didn't know." "I know you didn't," I said. And I meant it completely. "She told me." He stopped. Whatever Gwendolyn had told him about me, he couldn't finish the sentence. Maybe because saying it out loud now, in this room, with everything that had just happened rearranging the context around every memory he had, made it impossible to deliver. Clifton. I said his name, the way I had said it his entire life, not as a correction, just as a landing place. "You don't have to explain it today." He looked at me for a long moment. Then he reached for my hand. He took it the way he used to when he was small and we were crossing a street, not dramatically, just naturally, like it was simply where his hand belonged. I felt his fingers close around mine, and I did not make a sound. I did not cry. I simply held my son's hand in the middle of Hargrove Hall, surrounded by ivory flowers and dress chairs, and all the careful preparation for a future that was not going to happen the way anyone in this room had planned. We didn't have words yet for what this was. We didn't need them yet. That would come. The conversations, the reckoning, the slow rebuilding of something that had been taken apart piece by piece without either of us fully realizing it was happening. But his hand was in mine. That was enough to begin. The days after a thing like that do not announce themselves. They arrive the same way every other day arrives, morning light through the same windows, coffee in the same cup, the same quiet house settling around you. Except Everything inside the quiet has shifted slightly out of place. Not ruined, not healed either. Just rearranged in ways you are still learning to live around. The wedding did not happen. That is the simple fact, sitting at the center of everything that followed. And like most simple facts, it carried more weight than people outside it could fully understand. News traveled quickly, not because anybody held a press conference or wanted spectacle made from it, but because communities like ours have their own bloodstream. People who sat in that room talked to people who hadn't. Then those people talked to others. Within days, there were versions of the story moving through churches, beauty shops, family cookouts, offices. Some accurate, some not. Gwendolyn Covington disappeared from most of the spaces she used to move through comfortably. Not dramatically, quietly. The kind of quiet withdrawal people make when they realize every room now contains at least one person looking at them differently than before. I heard she stopped attending certain events. Heard she took leave from work for a while. Heard Ardenine moved out of her house temporarily after the wedding collapsed. I did not go searching for updates beyond that. Whatever consequences found Gwendolyn belonged to her now. The legal questions turned slower and messier than people expected. There were conversations about Roosevelt Ashford's old estate, about timelines, about whether anything should have been disclosed years ago. Nothing resolved neatly. Most things in real life don't. Lawyers talked, papers were requested. Then months passed with very little visible movement. And underneath all of it sat the same unavoidable truth. None of that changed what had almost happened in that room. Ardenine stayed in my thoughts often during those weeks. Not with pity. She would have hated that. But with a kind of quiet ache I could not entirely place. She was carrying a grief with no proper category for it. Not just the loss of a relationship, the loss of certainty, of identity, of trust in the person who raised her. There are wounds that arrive all at once. Then there are wounds that keep introducing themselves slowly for years afterward. I suspected hers would be the second kind. Clifton called me 4 days after the wedding. Then again, 3 days later. The first few conversations were awkward in places. Long silences, half-finished thoughts. You could hear both of us trying to step carefully around broken glass, neither one of us fully understood yet. We were not repaired. I want to be precise about that. Repair is not built from one apology or one emotional moment in a ruined wedding hall. But we were trying, and trying matters. Sometimes that is the first honest thing two people can offer each other after damage. He never finished that sentence from the wedding. The one about what Gwendolyn had told him about me over the years. I did not push him to. Some truths come out cleaner when they arrive on their own time instead of being dragged into daylight before they're ready. I think he still carries shame about it. I think I still carry hurt. Both things can exist together. I did not plan any of what happened at Hargrove Hall. I bought a dress. I got in my car. I walked through a door I had been told was not meant for me. Everything that came through that door afterward, the truth, the exposure, the collapse of carefully maintained lies, none of that was strategy. None of it was revenge. It was simply what happened when silence finally reached the end of itself. I am sitting in my kitchen now as I think about all of it. Same chair, same window, same morning light stretching itself slowly across the counter the way it always has. The house is still quiet, but it no longer feels like the quiet of being erased. For the first time in a very long time, it feels like the quiet of surviving.